All right, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2023 CRB Webinar Series. Today's webinar will provide a look at CRB-funded lemon variety and rootstock research for California. My name is Caitlin Stanton with the Citrus Research Board. Today I'm joined by McCall Machado and Dr. Joey Mayorkin, who are going to monitor the chat, and Dr. Melinda Klein, who will introduce our speakers. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be answered following the presentation. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Melinda, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist for Tree Fruit Crops at the University of Arizona, Dr. Glenn Wright. Dr. Wright earned his Ph.D. in horticulture from Texas A&M University and currently works with the commercial citrus and date palm industries in Southwest Arizona and Southern California. His research interests encompass all horticultural and post-harvest aspects of these crops. Dr. Wright has developed a course titled Citrus and Date Production, taught for the University of Arizona teaching program in Yuma, and he teaches citrus, date, and fruit tree culture to master gardeners and the general public. Today's presentation is entitled Lemon Scion and Rootstock Research for the California Grower. Glenn, please go ahead and share your screen to begin the presentation.
Well, thank you all. It's good to see we've got some folks listening and watching. And so just a bit of background. Lemons, of course, are the third most important citrus fruit grown in the United States, following orange and mandarins. And in 2021, we had a value of $660 million produced on about 23,000 hectares in California and Arizona. The main cultivars are Limoneira 8A Lisbon, which we'll talk about extensively, Corona Foothills, Allen Eureka, and there's some others that you will be talking about that you may have some interest in. And the CRB, as representatives of the growers and nursery owners of California, would like to have more information on the best scions and rootstocks for typical lemon growing regions of California. And we've actually also done some of this work in Arizona, but I'm not going to present that today. And of course, lemons have to be hand harvested and the labor costs are rising. So the growers are sometimes looking for smaller trees that are less costly to harvest. So the objectives of this particular work, which started in 2015, is to determine the yield and pack out and interior fruit quality for various lemon scions grown at 4 locations in California. Only 3 of them are going to be presented today. That will be at Santa Paula, Lindcove Field Station, and the CVARS station near Thermal, California. There's a 4th site at on campus at Riverside that we're not going to talk about in the interest of time. Also, we have some projects to determine the effect of rootstocks on lemon yield, pack out fruit size, and interior fruit quality. And then the other question that we'd like to answer is determine if some of the rootstocks produce smaller trees with improved yield efficiency, similar fruit size and quality as Macrophylla and Volcameriana, because it would be a good idea to have a smaller tree that would be easier to harvest and reduce one's labor costs if the trees were planted at higher densities. So as I mentioned, we have 4 sites. Only 3 of them are going to be talked about today. If you're from California, you're intimately aware of these sites: the Lindcove Field Station up in the Central Valley, the Santa Paula. We have these are on properties owned by the Limoneira company, and Thermal at the station owned by the University of California, Riverside, the Coachella Valley Agriculture Research Station near Thermal, California. So those are the sites. And we will start out with the Santa Paula work, and then we'll move on to the Lindcove work, and then we'll move on to the Thermal work. So if you're familiar with California, you know quite a bit about the area. If you're not, these are this on the left is a picture of when we planted in Santa Paula at one of the sites. And some of the information that I provided in the talk that I gave overseas last year. Therefore, occasionally when you see this talk, you'll see everything in metric units. But it's, of course, warm summer Mediterranean climate, mild summers. There is the influence of the ocean that leads to bloom all year long. Therefore, we harvest 3 or 4 times a year. The soil is quite variable. So we have 2 trials we're going to talk about here. The first one is the Scion trial, planted in spring 2015 at the Rancho de la Cuesta site on 22 by 16 foot spacing. There are 6 Scions. You will see these 6 Scions repeated in all of the trials that we do at the other locations as well. Limoneira 8A Lisbon as our control, Limoneira 8A IR1, which is an irradiated selection from the Roos Lab at University of California, Riverside. Corona Foothills, which is a variety that's become quite popular in the desert. It was originally, it is related to, well, it's similar to Eureka and also similar to Lisbon. It's related to Villafranca. It was first propagated by Young's Nursery in the Coachella Valley. There is Limoneira Fino 49, which is the chief winter lemon of Spain. It is neither a Lisbon nor a Eureka, but a Fino type or a Mesero type, but it's definitely a winter type lemon. Walker Lisbon, which is I guess I would say a long forgotten cultivar that I picked out of the variety collection at the Lindcove field station, and myself and a grower, we were walking through the variety block and noticed that this particular variety seemed to have a lot of fruit. And then the Yen Ben, which is a variety of lemon from New Zealand, which we ultimately, as of 2022, we stopped collecting data on that particular variety at this site because the fruit size is very small, the yields are very small, the fruit drops very easily, and so a lot of the fruit ends up on the ground unless you harvest it continually, and some of the trees have died. So we won't talk about that one. I will mention it briefly at one of the other sites. For the Scion trial, there's 3 different rootstocks: Carrizo citrans, Swingle citromolo, and Macrophylla. The rootstocks will change depending on what the site is. So the rootstocks at Lindcove and the rootstocks at Thermal for this particular Scion trial will be different. And we have 18 trees of each Scion. We also have a rootstock trial in Santa Paula. This is at the lower 40 site, also 22 by 16 spacing, but it's on beds. The Scion is Limoneira 8A Lisbon, and we have 14 rootstocks, which I won't go through them, but you'll see them listed over and over again, and we have 12 trees of each. We have some conventions with this particular experiment, not only here in Santa Paula, but also elsewhere. In a harvest season, I consider to begin on August 1st and end on September 30, or yeah, on July 31st of the coming year. So when we talk about a 2021 season, we're talking about August 1st of 20 to July 31st of 21, for example. And sometimes we collect fruit quality data. We do not collect it from this particular site here in Santa Paula because of the CDFA quarantine regulations. We would have to tarp the fruit, and we bring it to Yuma for analysis, and it's just not practical to bring the fruit all the way from Santa Paula. But we do collect fruit quality data from other sites because it's easier to avoid some of those quarantine zones. So the cumulative Scion yields from 16-17 through 21-22 for the Scion rootstock trial shows that we have a couple of high performers. And I would say throughout this talk, we'll have statistics on all of these bars. And so if the letters are the same, for example, A versus A through D or A, B, C, then there's no significant difference. But we do obviously have some quantitative differences, but not necessarily always yield differences. So in this particular trial, 8A on MAC was a great performer. Walker on MAC was also a great performer. We have some others that are almost as good. Walker on Swingle, Walker on Carrizo, 8A on Swingle, Fino 49 on Swingle. Fino 49 was pretty interesting because Swingle was its best rootstock, which wasn't always the case with some of the other varieties, and Corona on MAC. Now this is kind of messy. And so if you want to go and you want to look at it a little bit cleaner, you can see that if you pool all those rootstocks together, that 8A and Walker were the best. But remember, we have some rootstocks in here for some of the varieties like Corona and Fino that bring the overall amount of yield down. But nevertheless, 8A and Walker are clearly the better two, and IR1 is pretty good. It is, remember, the seedless selection from this particular block. For 22-23, we've only harvested once. We harvested this particular trial in late July of 22, which would be the 21-22 season, and we harvested then again in February of 23, and then we harvested again last week, and I don't have the data yet. But if you look at the harvests from February, you can see that the better performers in this case are the Corona Foothills and the Pheno 49, and the 8As are almost as good. So we have a bit of a shift here, and that's because I think that the Corona Foothills and the Pheno 49 put most of their crop on in the winter time, not maybe in the fall when we harvest in September, or we harvest through about December, January, and here we are early February. We typically get a pretty good proportion of the crop for these Coronas and the Pheno 49s at that time of year, whereas it takes a little bit longer for the 8As and the Walkers to get with the program. But overall, what we find for the entire season is the 8A and the Walker have bigger yields. It's just that their yields tend to be shifted a little bit to the winter spring rather than the fall winter. And the IR1 is very similar to its seedy counterpart, the 8A. Now we've done packout, and we do packout for every harvest, and this is actually packout that we send through the Limoneira's company's wash line in Santa Paula, and there's not a lot of difference there. I would however, say that for this particular trial, you might say that Pheno 49 and Corona Foothills have a little bit bigger fruit than the other varieties. But that's not always the case. It is often the case for the first harvest of the season, but not for some of the later harvests. And IR1 actually has a little bit larger fruit than its seedy counterpart 8A, and I think that's because typically we have a little bit fewer fruit on the IR1 versus the 8A. And so we do give a lot of credit to Limoneira for allowing us to run this fruit through the pack line. For the Santa Paula Scions, the Walker Lisbon has the greatest cumulative yield, followed closely by Limoneira 8A, 8A IR1, Pheno 49, and Corona Foothills, but the differences aren't particularly large. Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 mature the greatest portion of their crop in the fall and the winter time, while 8A has more mature fruit in the winter and the spring. Fruit size of Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 are consistently larger, at least in the fall, than the others, and Walker Lisbon has a little bit smaller fruit, even though it has the best yield. Macrophylla is clearly the best rootstock for all the signs, except for Pheno 49, which is performing best on Swingle. I don't know why. Trees on Carrizo perform the worst, regardless of scion, and the yields of the IR1 are typically 85 to 90% of the yields of 8A, and the fruit of IR1 are slightly larger than those of its seedy counterpart, 8A. Now we have the rootstock trial, which is down the road at the lower 40 block. And in this case, Macrophylla and Volcameriana are clearly the best rootstocks. They're significantly better than the others. We have a lot of other varieties. There's Carrizo, Citramon 1449, X639, Sunky by Flying Dragon, Carpenter, C35, Fir, C146, Swingle, Bitters, Brazil Sour, and Rich 16-6 Trifoliate. And so we see something like this, not only for the cumulative yield from 18-19 through 21-22. This is the 21-22 yield. So this is just kind of a magnification on the last full season's harvest that we have, and you can see that the trends are about the same. But we're not necessarily interested in the rootstocks that produce the most if they're on a large tree, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit again. And here is the first harvest in February for the varieties or the rootstocks, and you can see the trends are about the same, although Volcameriana didn't perform quite as well as it would normally do. And interestingly enough, bitters has quite a good yield for itself. And I'll show you why I'm interested in bitters here in a second. So when we look at yield efficiency, and I'm sorry, but this is in metric because I gave this talk overseas a while back. And you look at the kilograms of fruit per cubic meter, then we get yield efficiency. And this is important because you really would like to have a small tree with a fairly large amount of crop, so that if you wanted to plant them together or at much higher density, you might be able to have a better yield per acre. And the clear winner from the standpoint of yield efficiency is bitters. The amount of fruit is smaller, but the tree is amazingly small. The tree is probably less than half the size of the Volk trees. So you could plant them probably 2.5 to 1 versus those Volk trees and have quite a good yield. And I think that's pretty interesting. And they don't require a ladder. And I'd be happy at some point when we're out there harvesting, if you want to contact me, we can show you those trees. They're really pretty interesting. And C22 is been tested in Florida also, and where it's known as a kind of a dwarfing rootstock. And it was introduced as somewhat of a dwarfing rootstock as well. Also, now Macrophylla, of course, has a high yield efficiency, but the problem is it's a large tree. So what we'd like a similar yield efficiency on a smaller tree, and that's what you get with C22, and to a lesser extent with some of these others, Citramon 1449, X639, Carpenter, and C35. So maybe you could plant, if you're going to plant 100 trees per acre of Macrophylla or Volk, you might be able to get by with 150 trees per acre of some of these others, and 200 trees per acre with the C22 because it's quite a bit smaller. Packout, packout is pretty messy here, but I did want to point out, of course, Volca Mariana has good fruit size. Macrophylla, it wasn't quite so good, but it wasn't bad. Sunky by Flying Dragon had pretty good fruit size. Carrizo had pretty good fruit size, and X639 had pretty good fruit size, and Rich 16.6 had really terrible fruit size. In fact, Rich 16.6 was the worst performer of all the rootstocks at this particular site. So when considering yield, Mac and Volk have the greatest yield. Carrizo and several other of the Poncirus hybrids have lesser yields. C22, Brazil Sour Orange, and Trifoliate Orange, that's Rich 16.6, have the least yields. But C22 has good yield efficiency, a 50 to 60% reduction in tree size and a 45% reduction in yield when compared with Mac and Volk. Citramon 1449, C54, X639, and C35 are also quite good. Sunky by Flying Dragon, X639, Volk, and Citramon 1449 had the best fruit size for this last season. That's not necessarily always the case for every harvest, but irrespective of harvest, Rich 16.6 produced the smallest fruit. All right, let's go on to Lindcove. Lindcove, of course, in the Central Valley. Here are the characteristics: a little bit lower pH, soil pH, a greater chance of frost or freeze. As a result, we did not include Macrophylla or Volca Mariana in this particular trial, and really in the scion or the rootstock trials. We planted these trials at the same time, almost the same day as we planted them at Santa Paula in spring of 2015, 24 by 19 foot spacing on beds. There are 6 scions, the same 6 scions that you noted in the previous trials at Santa Paula. 3 rootstocks, but the rootstocks are different: Carrizo Citran, C35, and Rich 16.6 Trifoliate. Again, 18 trees of each scion. In the rootstocks, we have planted in spring of 2016, 1 year later. The scion again is Limoneira 8A, and we have 11 rootstocks instead of 14 as we had in Santa Paula, because some of them we naturally eliminated the Mac and the Volk. The harvest season the same, and we do collect fruit quality data from this site, which I will present to you. Well, I will present the fruit quality data for the scion trial, not for the rootstock trial, in the interest of time. So the cumulative scion yields for this particular trial, the overall winner again is Walker, similar to the trial in Santa Paula. Walker on C35 was the best performer. Walker on Rich was also a very good performer. Some of these others were okay. 8A on C35, Corona on Rich, Pheno 49 didn't perform very well at this particular site. And we also have, we have a 8AR1, which didn't perform as well as its CD counterpart. Unlike in Santa Paula, where we had 85 to 90% of the yield with IR1 versus 8A IR1 versus 8A. 8A IR1 didn't perform quite so well at this particular site. And I told you I would mention Yenben. Here's the Yenben yield. It's totally, it's not even worth our time anymore to hardly report the data, but because it just doesn't yield at all. And we've had, when there's nothing there, that means all the trees on this particular rootstock have died. So there you go. But if you look at this from the standpoint of pooling all the rootstocks together, you'll see that Walker is still the best. 8A is statistically the same, although quantitatively less. And Corona Foothills, Pheno 49, and IR1 are followers, and then Yenben is at the bottom. So we harvested once for this trial in 22 on the 13th of December. And again, this particular year, Walker did very well, but all the other ones did very well as well. You can see, for example, all those bars with A's on them, they're not statistically different from each other because we had quite a bit of variability. So pretty much statistically, at least, everything, all the Coronas, all the Pheno 49s, all the 8As, and all the Walkers were the same, although Walker had more fruit than the others, but just there was some variability there. And the IR ones were lagging, and the Yenben was lagging even more. So this is a little bit different than what we've seen in previous years. Again, I would say that most of the crop for the Corona Foothills and the Pheno 49s occur maybe when we harvest twice. Much of that particular crop is a little bit earlier than some of the fruit from the 8A, but it's not as, that difference is not as distinct in Lindcove as it is in Santa Paula. Packout, well, we have a clear winner here. The IR1 has much larger fruit than any of the others. And I had to choose this packout from 2021 this year because we have not been able to have all the data analyzed for the 22 season yet. But this is not, this is fairly similar to what we see. So 8AIR1 has smaller fruit. Has less fruit. So naturally it would have larger fruit. Of not counting 8AIR1, you could say that maybe Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 are a little bit bigger than 8A, but not much. And Walker, again, has a little bit smaller fruit. And here in the desert, we always think that big fruit is better, but sometimes if you're if you're elsewhere in California, you may want to have smaller fruit. So Walker might be an advantage. We do have some interior fruit quality. This is from 2020. So there were only a little bit of difference in this particular trial. The seeds per fruit. So the IR1 definitely has less seeds, 1.6 seeds per fruit versus 8.5 on its CD counterpart, and as many as 12 for Corona Foothills, 8 for Pheno 49, and Yenben had 6.3, so less. But again, the fruit, the quantity of fruit off of Yenben, I think, really takes it off the table. The juice percentage was similar, 45 to 49%. The pH was similar, 2.6, 2.7. The peel thickness in millimeters was about the same. And we do a subjective rating of peel smoothness. And Yenben definitely has the smoothest fruit. However, again, it's quite small and the yields are rather poor. So for the Lindcove Scions, Walker Lisbon has the greatest cumulative yield, followed rather closely by 8A. Corona Foothills, Pheno 49, and Limoneira 8A IR1. The fruit size of 8A IR1 is usually larger than the others, again, because it has less fruit. The Corona Foothills, Pheno 49, and the 8A are similar in fruit size. The Walker Lisbon has slightly smaller fruit size than the others, and the Yenben has the smallest fruit size. Regarding rootstocks, the C35 and the rich 16-6 are slightly better for all the scions except for Pheno 49, which performs best on Carrizo, and the Yenben, which is only still living on the C35. So I think that, and this is interesting to me because the rich 16-6 performs so poorly in Santa Paula, but it's really a pretty good rootstock in Lindcove, and actually it's a pretty good rootstock on our trails at Riverside as well, where I'm not able to report to you today. Yields of seedless Limoneira 8A IR1 are about 75% of the yields of 8A. That's a little bit lower than the 80 to 90% of yields for this variety that we would see in Santa Paula versus its seedy counterpart. And the interior fruit quality of all the scions was similar, except for fruit seediness, with the IR1 having less than 2 seeds per fruit, and all the others having 6 to 12 seeds. All right, now let's move to the rootstocks. Now remember, there's no MAC and no Volk here. And so we have some cumulative yields, and remember how small the bitters was in Santa Paula. In Lindcove, the bitters is actually the best performing rootstock. With accumulation from 22 that, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go. I guess I need to go back. Anyway, the tree is not as small, but it is the best performer of all of them. There's a lot of variability here, so all of these ones with A's are not statistically different, and it's the same, pretty much the same rootstocks, the X639 and the Brazil Sour kind of trail. So this is through 21-22. Now, if you look at 22-23, the one harvest we had, again, the X639 and the Brazil Sour were the worst, and all of the others are really not a lot of difference, somewhere between 200 and 250 pounds of fruit per tree. Citramon 1449 was the winner last in the 22-23 season, and the bitters, again, very similar. So that's where we're at. So not a lot of difference. Now, maybe if we had MAC and Volk in there, we would see a difference. But again, because of the potential for frost in the valley, we chose not to include them. The yield efficiency is not quite as dramatic because, again, we don't have MAC and Volk in this particular trial, but many of them are pretty good. You can see, for example, that the bitters actually is not the smallest tree. The rich 16-6 trifoliate and the Citramon 1449 are a bit smaller, but the bitters has quite a lot of yield. But actually the winner in this case is the Citramon 1449. It makes a relatively small tree as compared with Carrizo and C35 that make larger trees. And but it has a actually one of the best yields of all of them. So this is interesting. It might make some of you consider some of the rootstocks that you might want to plant with your new lemon plantings. Packout, well, not a lot of difference here. In fact, I really couldn't pull out much of anything there. The bitters is a little bit larger, but I don't know that that's significant. This fruit is run through the wash line at the Lindcove field station itself, and we get a lot of help from them, from Don Cleek and those folks there. But again, we don't see a lot of difference in these rootstocks as far as packout goes. So for the rootstocks, in the absence of MAC and Volk, the C22, the Citramon 1449, the C57, and the C35 had the best yields. Several other trifoliate hybrids have lesser yields, but not a lot less. And the X639 and the Brazil Sour Orange have the least yields. The Citramon 1449, C22, C35, Sunky by Flying Dragon, and the rich 16-6 trifoliate have the best yield efficiency. And the fruit size for all the rootstocks is fairly similar, but the bitters and the Carrizo do have slightly larger fruit size. All right, now we'll talk about thermal down in the desert. If you're from thermal, you know all about it. It's hot desert climate. The average rainfall is 90 millimeters, not a lot. So pH of 8.2, it can get higher than that. Exceptionally hot summer, mild winter. What that means from the standpoint of lemons is we get very large trees, and sometimes the yield suffers. The scions we planted again in spring of 2015 at the CVARS station, 22 by 20 feet. Spacing no beds, that's because the soil is very sandy. And so you can't maintain beds necessarily. The picture kind of looks like there is beds, but they're not anymore. There are 6 scions. These are the same 6 scions that we saw elsewhere in the other trials. And again, we stopped collecting data on yenben as the fruit size and the yields are too small. And some of the trees have died, although the trees on Macrophylla are doing, the yenben trees on Macrophylla are doing the best, but they're still not anything close to the other varieties. We have 3 rootstocks. We have the Carrizo citrange, like we have in all of the other sites, and we have Macrophylla and Volcameriana, because these are very common rootstocks in the desert. And again, there's 18 trees of each scion. For the rootstocks, we planted them in spring 2016, the same time approximately that we planted the other trials in Lindcove and Santa Paula. The scion is 8A Lisbon lemon. You might ask why we didn't use Corona Foothills as the scion down here. Well, we wanted to be consistent between the thermal site and all the other sites. We have 11 rootstocks similar to what we have in Lindcove, but the mix is different. We have Macrophylla and Volcameriana, which we didn't have in that other location. We have Carrizo as kind of our standard, and we have a range of citrandrins and citranges. We don't, for example, have rich 16.6 trifoliate, as we didn't figure that it would do very well. Harvest season again, August through July. I should know my months better than this. And the fruit quality data we do collect from CVARS, and we take it down to Yuma and we analyze it there, and I'll present that to you in a moment. So cumulative scion yields, well, it's a little bit different here, not surprisingly. The best performer is Corona on Macrophylla, and the second best performer is Pheno 49 on Macrophylla. And this result mirrors results that we had, that Tracy Kahn and I had on a previous trial that we planted in 2006. And we continued with that particular trial through 2016 or 2017 or so. Corona, in that particular trial, Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 on Macrophylla were the best producers. And that is the case in this trial as well. Walker is statistically similar because of high variability, and 8A is also statistically similar, but quantitatively, those two don't perform quite as well. And we have quite a number of them that don't perform very well at all. So none of them on Carrizo perform well. Corona on Carrizo isn't good. Pheno 49 on Carrizo, 8A on Carrizo, IR1 on Carrizo, Walker on Carrizo, yenben on Carrizo is definitely the worst of them all. And Volk is kind of intermediate. It's not as good as Macrophylla in this particular trial, but it's not nearly as bad as Carrizo for all the scions tested. And if you go and you pool all those together, you'll see that Corona and Pheno 49 are definitely the best producers, followed by Walker, which is almost the same as Pheno 49. And 8A, it comes in fourth, and IR1 is even less. And you'll note that the distance or the reduction in yield in IR1 versus 8A is even more than we saw in Lindcove, and definitely a lot more reduction versus what we saw in Santa Paula. When you take the 22-23 yield, wow, we had a heck of a harvest last year. Some of the varieties had over 700 pounds of fruit per tree. The Pheno 49 on Mac, we harvested it twice. It went through the roof, almost 750 pounds of fruit per tree. The Corona on Mac, about 700 pounds of fruit per tree, and we had several in the mid to upper 500 pounds of fruit per tree, especially Corona on Volk. It's interesting because Pheno 49 doesn't perform as well on Volk as it does as Corona performs on Volk. I should mention also, just as an aside, Pheno 49 was brought in by Nick Sokovich in the late 1980s and has been in the collection at the CCPP for a number of years. And so that's why we have it. And Walker has been in that collection as well. And Corona Foothills is in that collection as well. So that's the 22-23 season. That was a backbreaking harvest. When we look at the packout, now this is the fruit that we ran through the wash line at Richard Bagdasarian in Mecca. And not surprisingly, maybe the IR1 fruit on Volk and that on Carrizo had the best fruit size because we had less fruit of it. Okay, and some of the others, well, it's a little bit harder to pull out some of the good ones. Maybe 8A on Carrizo was pretty good size. Maybe Foothills on Mac was pretty good size. But definitely the best was the IR1 on the various rootstocks because there was less fruit. And we didn't run the Yenben through the packing house at all. So the Pheno 49 on Carrizo, the Pheno 49s do not like Carrizo and the fruit size is terrible. But Pheno 49 performs pretty well on some of the other variety, on some of the other rootstocks. Here's the fruit quality. You may remember the quality from the Lindcove trial. We definitely have more seeds here at CVARS than we do at Lindcove. You remember the Limoneira 8A IR1 at Lindcove had less than 2 seeds per fruit. Here we have less than 3 seeds per fruit. You may also remember that the Limoneira or the Lindcove trial had 6 to 10 seeds per fruit on all the other varieties. And here we are at 4 to 12, almost 13 fruit seeds per variety. We also found there was a difference in juice percentage, primarily because the Yenben has very thin peel and lots of juice, even though the fruit's quite small. And so all the others are the same. The juice pH is a little bit more acidic here than it is in at the Lindcove field station. The peel thickness is definitely a little bit different, primarily because the Pheno 49 and the Yenben had thinner peel, and the smoothness, well, the Yenben is much smoother than the rest. And so there was a significant difference. But again, the Yenben yield was so small, it's not worth continuing with this particular trial. So for the scions at Thermal through 21-22, Corona Foothills had the greatest cumulative yield, followed closely by Pheno 49 and the Walker Lisbon. 8A and 8AR1 trailed a little bit, not by much, but some. The difference between Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 likely narrowed due to the 2023 harvest results. Macrophylla was clearly the best rootstock for all the scions from the standpoint of yield, especially for the Pheno 49. The next best was Volk, and they all performed poorly on Carrizo. The fruit size of the IR1 was usually larger than the others because, again, it had less fruit. The Corona Foothills, the Pheno 49, and the 8A have similar fruit size. The fruit of the Walker Lisbon, again, was slightly smaller than the others. The Yenben tree had the smallest fruit size. The yields of IR1 are only 60 to 70% of the yields of 8A, which again is less than the ratio that we found at the Lindcove field station and much less than the ratio that we found in Santa Paula. IR1 had less than 3 seeds per fruit. Yenben had 5 seeds per fruit, and all the others had about 11 to 13. The Yenben fruit was smaller, thinner peeled with a greater juice content than the other scions. Now, rootstocks. Well, not surprisingly, the Mac and the Volk had the best, but again, the Mac outperformed the Volk. This is something that we see really all the time. Done many years of rootstock trials in Arizona, and the Mac is always the best, and the Volk is always next best, and that is reflected in this particular trial as well. Everything else, well, not statistically different than the Volk, but not as good. The 1449, the Sunkhiba Flying Dragon, the Bitters, just not as good as the Mac, and almost as good as the Volk, but not nearly as good as the Mac. And the 22-23 yields very similar patterns. Okay, so the Mac and the Volk were the best, and everything else kind of trailed off. When we look at yield efficiency, well, the best yield efficiency is the Mac tree, which, you know, leads to a result that we really don't have a good dwarfing tree for the desert, even though you know, bitters might do well at Santa Paula. It's not very good in the desert, at least so far. You can see, for example, bitters down here. It doesn't have a very good yield efficiency. It is definitely a smaller tree, but it it complements its small tree size with a smaller yield, which is not what we want. So if you force me to pick something out, Citramon 1449 was the smallest tree, and it had the highest yield for a smallest tree, but it's still not great. But it's better than Volk, and it's better than Sunky by Flying Dragon, but it's not better than Macrophylla. Macrophylla, as you'll note, is way up here, so it has a huge tree with a big yield. So that was a bit of a disappointment considering the results that we found at the other locations. Packout. Again, this fruit is run through Richard Bagdasarian. What has the best fruit size? Well, actually Bitters has a pretty good fruit size, despite the fact that it doesn't have a lot of it, and the tree is fairly small. Macrophylla naturally has a pretty good fruit size. Volcamariana has a pretty good fruit size. These actually need to be moved up a bit. And 146 has pretty good fruit size. And the worst is X639. Fruit size is relatively small. So for the rootstocks, well, Mac and Volk have the greatest yield in the desert. Citramon 1449 has lesser yields. That would be third. C22, Sunky by Flying Dragon. Hope I have C22 in there twice, sorry. C54 and several others have lesser yields. Brazil Sour and Carrizo have the least yields. Carrizo performs very well in some locations, but not well in the desert. Citramon 1449 has good yield efficiency versus Volk, a 23% reduction in tree size and a 12% reduction in yield, but it doesn't compare well with Mac. And trees on Mac and Volk have the best fruit size. Bitters and C46 have trees with pretty good fruit size, but not as good as Mac and Volk. And X639 in this case has the smallest fruit size, at least for the harvest that we looked at. So in summary, in regards to the scions, well, in Santa Paula, Walker Lisbon has the best yield, but smaller fruit size. Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 have lower yields than some of the others, but more fall and winter fruit, less spring fruit, and the largest fruit size. 8A has the second best yield overall, similar fruit size to Walker, and the IR1's yields are 85 to 90% of Limoneira 8A, larger fruit size than 8A, and similar crop distribution. At Lindcove, Walker Lisbon has, again, the best yield and smaller fruit size. Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 generally have lower yields than Walker and similar or lower yields compared with 8A, but again, more fall winter fruit, less spring fruit, real good fruit size. It's usually the second best yield with similar, that's the 8A. The 8A has similar fruit size to Corona Foothills, but with the second largest yield. IR1 yields about 75% of 8A, larger fruit size than 8A with a similar crop distribution, and Yenben has the smallest yield and the smallest fruit size. At Thermal, regarding scions, well, Corona Foothills has the best yield and excellent fruit size. Pheno 49 has the second best, almost as good as Corona Foothills with similar fruit size, sometimes larger, sometimes about the same. Walker has less yields than Corona Foothills or Pheno 49, but generally more than 8A, typically smaller fruit size. 8A has smaller, lower yields than the three previous ones, Corona Foothills, Pheno 49, and Walker. It has good sized fruit, just not as much of it. And IR1 has yields of 60 to 70% of that of IRA, but the fruit size is bigger. So you can see some trends here. If I was going to plant IR1, I would probably plant it firstly in Santa Paula on the coast, where it's most likely to perform as well or almost as well as its seedy counterpart. If I was going to plant Walker, I'd probably plant Walker either at Santa Paula or Lindcove, particularly if you're looking for fruit that will be a bit smaller if you're harvesting your fruit during a window when large fruit is actually cheaper than small fruit. Walker might be worth looking at. Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 is kind of the opposite. If you're trying to get an earlier piece of fruit, which is a little bit larger, Corona Foothills or Pheno 49 might be a good choice for some of your orchards. Of course, Limoneira 8A is the standard, so it's pretty good. in both Santa Paula and Lindcove, but it's not so good in the desert. And so we wouldn't necessarily, I mean, most growers in Arizona don't plant Limoneira 8A anymore because Corona Foothills and Pheno 49 are a little bit better than 8A. In the desert, Corona Foothills, I guess, is our standard, and Pheno 49 is newer, of course, but there are some people who have it, and I think they're pretty happy with it. I don't know that I plant IR1 in the desert at all because it doesn't have the yield. Regarding rootstocks, in Santa Paula, C22 has the smallest trees compared with MAC or Volk with real good yield efficiency. C35, C54, X639, Citramon 1449 have smaller trees with good yield efficiency. And Sunky by Flying Dragon, Volk, Carrizo, and X639 have the best fruit size. If I was wanting to plant an orchard with high density, I would definitely try, with C22. I don't know that I'd go whole hog and plant 300 acres to start out with, but I definitely plant a couple dozen acres and on C22 and see how it works. It's probably worth, if you're the gambling type, it's probably worth trying. At Lindcove, C22, Citramon 1449, C35, Sunky by Flying Dragon, and Rich 16.6 have smaller trees with the best yield efficiency, and they all have similar fruit size. So again, maybe I'd try something a little bit closer with higher planting density with some of these other varieties. Again, this is in the absence of MAC and Volk. And thermal, well, again, the one with the best yield efficiency was Citramon 1449. Might be worth planting it at a little bit higher density, but none of them compare well with Macrophylla. And they all have good fruit size: MAC, Volk, Carrizo, C22, and 146. So I'd like to acknowledge at UCR a number of people, including my co-authors, of course, Mike Roos and Tracy Kahn, but also Claire Federici, Zach Thomas, Daniel Reyes, Tony Siebert, Karine Trinell, Danelle Seymour, Ryan Piscatella, Norm Elstrand, Mike Carty, and others. I'm sure I've forgotten some of them. At Lindcove Field Research and Extension Center, Don Cleek and his crew have been very helpful with us. From the University of Arizona, my technicians, Arturo Moreno, Hector Insunza, Joel Pena, Alyssa Pena, and recently John Juarez have been very helpful. The Limoneira company has been invaluable in helping us, and the Richard Bagdasarian also in thermal. The Ventura County Cooperative Extension, Ben Faber, sometimes he comes out with a bunch of master gardeners that feed us coffee and donuts and pick for free. And of course, you can't argue with that. And of course, the funding from the California Citrus Research Board has been vital for this particular project. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening, and I will answer any type of questions that you might have.
Thank you, Glenn, for that very informative presentation. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A function right now, and we will get to those. It's right at the bottom of your screen. So we've had a few come in during the talk. So the first one that we had is asking if there's any information on the tolerance of the rootstocks to root disease and what types of soil they do best in.
Well, this particular project doesn't have information on that, but it's not difficult to find information on all of these, including the most recent Citrandarin C22, C54, and C57. In the desert, we're primarily worried about Phytophthora root rot, and that's one of the reasons why we use Macrophylla and Volcamariana, because they're more tolerant of Phytophthora root rot than the old rootstock, which is rough lemon. So that's, I guess, the best way I can answer this relatively quickly, but you can very easily Google search these rootstocks. There is the California Citrus Production Manual that you can find information about these rootstocks, and there's several others.
And then kind of along the same line, is there any big difference in the soil, physical, and chemical characteristics between the study sites?
Well, there is some difference. Probably the biggest difference is between the desert and everything else, in that this desert is quite sandy and there's quite a bit more clay at both Lindcove and Santa Paula. The pH levels are similar. The water pH levels are similar. The slope is quite a bit different depending on, and of course the climate, particularly in the coast, is different. So you'll note that for each site, I have a section where we talk about the characteristics of the site. So I would encourage you to look at that.
Okay. And so the results that you shared are mostly focused on yield and fruit size. What about if a variety has great fruit size, but a little amount of juice?
Well, we don't really want a variety that has great fruit size, but a low amount of juice. So we haven't really noted, except for the yenben, where there's been a significant difference in the amount of juice. Of course, juice quantity often depends on when you harvest the fruit. The longer you wait, the more juice you're going to have. And we often have less juice in the desert than we do elsewhere because we harvest the fruit somewhat early. So we haven't found a variety that has less juice than any one, but we have found one, which is the yenben, which has more. But again, it has so many other really bad characteristics that I wouldn't suggest planting it.
And then another question, what is the conversion of pounds on the tree to field boxes, or is it bins up from the tree?
Well, a bin typically has about 900 to 1,000 pounds of fruit in it. But I don't usually talk about bins per tree, because then we get into fractional bins, half a bin per tree, something along those lines. A field box, at least in Arizona, is 60 pounds, and we still use that. In California, they don't use it quite as much. And in Florida, of course, a field box is a different size. I think it's a 90-pound field box. That's why I talk about pounds per tree, because then you can pretty easily go and recalculate to whatever you'd like based on that information.
Yeah, Juan was asking, do you have CTV in California? And if so, is there any interaction between CTV and macrophilia?
So yeah, in California, I mean, probably the California people should answer this better than I, but there is CTV in the Central Valley. We have some trees that we expect, a couple of them have CTV, but they're not the macrophylla particular variety. Actually, macrophylla, the CTV that affects macrophylla is seedling yellows. And so it more affects the nursery trees than it does the trees once they're in the field. In the desert, we don't have, well, we have CTV, but it doesn't spread very far because it's so hot, and the aphid that spreads it has a very difficult time surviving. So we have it, but it's not really a production issue in the desert. And in Santa Paula, frankly, I guess I don't know. You would have to contact people who live there, or UC experts who are there.
So again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we will answer them live.
Okay, and I would also say that if you have further questions of me, my name is Glenn Wright, University of Arizona. You can Google search me very easily, and you can find my email address, and I'll be happy to help you out.
Of course. And here is Glenn's email address right here on our end screen. And then please make sure to mark your calendar for our last webinar next Tuesday. We'll be talking about California water efficiency strategies with Dr. Franklin Gowdy. So thank you again to everyone that joined us today. To stay up to date on upcoming CRB events, be sure to visit our website, citrusresearch.org. Thank you, everyone.